I'm Cindy Joyner. I'm in the Division of Cardiovascular Disease at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And I'm going to talk to you today just about an introduction to device studies. And it's really meant to be just a basic introduction to doing clinical trials or device studies. So our objectives are first to define a medical device and discuss the types of medical device studies, discuss regulations surrounding medical device studies, present the regulatory pathway for medical device studies, and then just spend a little bit of time discussing the nuances of medical device studies. So first, this seems like an easy question, but what do all these items have in common? And since we're talking about device studies today, they are all devices. So I think when a lot of people think of devices, they think of pacemakers or implantable devices, things like that. But really, the FDA views bandages, dental floss, infusion pumps, and stents, all these other types of things that people would normally think of devices. They also think of Band-Aids and those types of things as well. Just to give you an introduction of or to the medical device industry, it is a major sector of healthcare. It's over $1 billion industry, and it is relatively small compared to the pharmaceutical industry. But in the past decade, there's been significant growth. And it wasn't until 1995 that we really had our first requirements that devices be reviewed and approved before commercial distribution. One of the areas that seems to be challenging for regulatory authorities is device research, because there's so much innovation, and right now there's a little bit of controversy in this area. So on one side of the fence, people feel, or scientists feel, that we need a tougher approval process and some stricter regulations to prevent recalls and device failures. But on the other side of the fence, some of these scientists think if you impose those stricter regulations or tougher approval processes, then you could essentially slow down innovation and potentially harm patients. So it's a real area right now that if you're going to read into the literature, it's interesting to see both sides of the controversy. Before we really get into the rest of the talk, I want to truly define what a medical device is. And this is based on the FDA Section 201. This is what they consider to be a medical device. And so it's an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including any component, part, or accessory, which is intended for use in diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Or it's intended to affect the structure or function of the body and does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action within the body, and which is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. You can see here I highlighted primary intended purposes, and so I want to give you an example of what that means. So a common or a new device in cardiovascular research is a drug-eluting stent. And so when you think of the stent, its primary purpose is really to hold open a vessel. But it's eluted with a drug, and so the drug helps do this, but the whole point of the stent is really to hold open the vessel, and that's the primary end purpose. So when you're thinking of defining a device, you really have to think of what the final outcome is, or the whole purpose of that item. In device research, we have a lot of the same regulatory authorities as in drug research. There's the FDA, or the Federal Drug Authority, and then within the FDA, there's two centers that are highly involved. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which is the CDRH, and the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which is CBER. There's the Office of Human Subjects, or Office of Human Research Protections, OHRP, and the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. We have a lot of the same regulations, Belmont Report, Declaration of Helsinki, and within OHRP, 45 CFR 46 is relative device research, and that's the protection of human subjects. Within the ISO, clinical investigation of medical devices for human subjects, good clinical practice, is very relevant to device research. The FDA has a number of regulations specific to device research, and These range from 21 CFR 807 through 21 CFR 892. And you can see here the different regulations and what they relate to. I would spend some time looking at the regulations and looking at the FDA website if you're going to be getting into device research, or if you're currently doing device research. It's a good way to refresh your memory and see if there's anything new. We also follow 21 CFR 50, the protection of human subjects, and then 21 CFR 56, the institutional review boards. The main regulation I'm really going to focus on is the IDE. So that's the investigational device exemption. And the conduct of medical device studies is regulated under the IDE regulations. The FDA considers devices to be into 3 classes. The first class is a non-invasive, simple, or low-risk device. It's typically a bandage, nasal cannula, or bedpan. There's no FDA approval needed for this type of device. It's typically exempt from the pre-market notification 510K process, which I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. And they typically register the device and company on the FDA website. Class 2 is a medium-risk device. This is something similar to an infusion pump, IV catheter, or blood pressure cuff. It does require FDA clearance, and this is typically done through the pre-market notification 510K submission process. Class 3 is a high-risk device. It's typically used to support or sustain life, and there is significant risk of injury involved. These would be implantable pacemakers, blood vessel stents, or balloon catheters. And with this type of device, the FDA approval is required, and this is typically done through a pre-market approval process, or the PMA process, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So I mentioned the pre-market notification 510K. This is one route that a device can go for approval to be marketed. It's submitted to the FDA before a manufacturer proposes to market a medical device. If the FDA agrees the device is substantially equivalent, meaning it's very similar to something on the market, if it is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device for which a PMA is not required, it can be marketed immediately. Typically, the FDA does not require any clinical data for this type of submission process, but if it is required, it must comply with the IDE, IRB, and human subject protection regulations. The second process for a device to get to market is a pre-market approval process, or the PMA process. This is typically Class 3 devices must go this route. It's the most stringent type of device marketing, and if the FDA approves a PMA, it is determined the application has sufficient valid scientific evidence to ensure safe and effective use. Interestingly enough, only 10% of devices are considered by the FDA to be Class 3, which means only about 10% of devices go through this PMA process. I mentioned substantially equivalent when we talked about the 510K process. And when you're going to start a device study, one of the first things you really should consider is whether it's substantially equivalent, to decide what path you need to go down to market the device. So this is the flow chart I found. It asks several easy questions to help you determine if something is substantially equivalent and what route you need to take with the FDA for approval. This is another very simple flow chart. This is a handout as well. This is something I found with Emergo. It's a consulting CRO group specific to device research. They have an excellent website and some really good training. But this is a color-coded flow chart. I think it's one of the easiest ones I found. Very simple, easy to follow. And it breaks down Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 devices in the process that you would have to go through in order to market that device. It asks some very simple questions, gives good information. They also have a PowerPoint presentation that you can look at online that's very good as well. This is another just simple flow chart that you can look at and help decide what route you would have to take to market your device. When the FDA requires some studies to be done or clinical data to be collected, you have a couple different options. The first is a significant risk device study, or an SR. This is for devices that are implantable, present a risk for serious injury, they're represented to be for use in sustaining life, or their substantial importance in diagnosing, curing, or treating disease, and it presents a potential for serious risk to health. The FDA-approved IDE is required prior to study start. It's assigned an IDE number, which if you've done device trials, you might recognize this format, but it's a standard format that includes the year the IDE was submitted to the FDA. And then IRB approval is required, and typically your IRB is going to require a copy of the FDA IDE approval letter before they start or approve the study. The next type of study that can be done is a non-significant risk device study, or an NSR. This one, simply the device does not meet the definition of an SR, or significant risk device. The sponsor provides an assessment to the IRB of whether or not this is NSR, and you need to remember that your sponsor might be a company or it might be actual investigator if it's an investigator-initiated study. If the IRB determines a device is NSR, then an IDE does not need to be submitted to the FDA prior to study start. The FDA would actually consider the study to have an approved IDE once IRB approval is obtained. And because of this, many times the FDA is not aware of several NSR device studies that are being conducted. The last type of study would be an exempt study. And so this is where the study would be exempt from 21 CFR 812. It's a non-invasive device. It does not introduce any type of energy into a subject. It's typically an already cleared medical device. They're not collecting any type of safety or effectiveness data. And examples would be consumer preference testing or device modifications. This is another flowchart that I've shared. It's one that I found on the FDA website that helps you decide what route you need to take in order to market a study and conduct a study, market a device and conduct a study. It is nice in that it shares with you the regulations that are related to each step. So it's just a nice handy flowchart to keep on in your reference files. I thought it would be nice to compare and contrast drug and device studies. Many people are familiar with drug studies and how they work, and most people have a lot of experience in drug studies. So an easy way to look at the difference in these two, I just simply went down and we'll go through this together. So the first is a device typically works in a physical manner where a drug works in a chemical or biological manner. Devices are typically considered therapeutic or diagnostic, and it's heavily diagnostic many times. A drug is typically just considered therapeutic. Devices are invented, and this is done many times in close collaboration with clinicians. Drugs are discovered. This is usually done in a laboratory by a scientist. Devices can change during clinical development, meaning the device that they submit at the beginning of the study might change a little bit throughout the study. It can be due to software changes or minor modifications in the device or the actual software that is connected with the device. A drug does not change after development. In the course of a study, you're always using the same drug. You might change the dosing of the drug, but you don't ever change the drug itself. Device studies have a very short life cycle. They are typically only on the market for 3 to 4 years, and then they're replaced usually with something more innovative or something that has significant modifications to it. Drugs can be on the market for years. If they're on the market for so many years, and then they can go on the market again as a generic drug. So they can stay on market for a significant length of time. Drugs or devices are approved, like we talked about, through the PMA pathway, and sometimes they only require one single study in order to do this. Drugs are approved through the new drug application or NDA pathway, and we know that there's a significant number of studies that can be done. So they are done usually phase 1 through phase 4. Device studies are typically small companies with less than 50 employees, where drug companies are typically larger companies. The device studies are submitted to the FDA through the CDRH or the CBER centers for approval, where drugs are submitted through either CDER or CBER for approval. Devices typically do not require a controlled clinical trial, which we've talked about, and many times historical data just showing the device is safe and effective is usually sufficient to submit for a PMA. Where drug studies typically require at least 2 adequate, well-controlled trials. Devices use 3 study models: feasibility, pilot, and pivotal. Feasibility and pilot are considered the first in human studies. Drug studies, we have phases 1 through 4. With a device study, we do have what's called an investigator agreement, and this is very similar to the 1572 for drug studies. The 1572, if you've done drug studies, it's a standard form that the FDA has. So for device studies, we have no standard form. But what 21 CFR 812.43 outlines is the elements that should be included in an investigator agreement. In this states that a sponsor shall obtain from each participating investigator, that means a principal investigator and many times all the sub-investigators, a signed agreement. This agreement must include the investigator's CV or resume, a statement of the investigator's relative experience, if the investigator was involved in an investigation or other research that was terminated and why, a statement of the investigator's commitment to conduct the investigation in accordance with the agreement, the investigational plan, this part and other applicable FDA regulations, and condition of approval imposed by the reviewing IRB or FDA. They must supervise all testing of the device involving human subjects, and they must ensure that requirements for obtaining informed consent are met. They also need to provide sufficient, accurate financial disclosure information. Many times investigator agreements will come through your regulatory area, and with a startup packet for a new study, you'll typically find the investigator agreement there. An investigator agreement can be any length based on what the sponsor has decided. It can be 1 page, it can be 4 pages. You need to check with your institution and see how they like these processed. If this is something that your IRB needs or if this is something that your contracts office would need to review. With device studies, I do want to talk just a few minutes about cost implications. So the investigational device exemption regulations, or IDE regulations, allow sponsors to charge for an investigational device. However, the charge should not exceed an amount necessary to recover the cost of manufacture, research, development, and handling of the investigational device. A sponsor must justify the cost in the IDE application. So this is a little bit different from drug studies. So drug studies, typically the sponsor will provide everything that you need for the study, and they typically provide the drug. But due to the high costs involved in device studies, this isn't always the case. You need to make sure that your consent forms outline clearly the cost that will be billed to the participant, their insurance company, or the study. You should work with your coverage analysis team at your institution or the group that reviews your budgets and looks at providing you with your research rates. You should become familiar with your Medicare and your primary insurance provider's coverage guidelines. So at our institution, we know Blue Cross Blue Shield is a primary provider in our state. So you want to make sure you know what those guidelines are for device research in your area. And many times this can be very confusing for participants and for study staff. So you want to make sure that not just your participants understand the cost implications and where things are being billed, but also your study staff and coordinators. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, does provide coverage for investigational devices. And so medical devices under an IDE, like I have said, are complex and expensive to manufacture. So CMS will reimburse for the cost of the investigational medical devices that meet certain criteria, and you should become familiar with those criteria are. These are Category B investigational devices that CMS will cover, and before they will cover those, you must submit a request for reimbursement letter prior to study start and obtain CMS approval. So I know at our institution we have a process for this and a liaison that works with CMS and our institution. So if you're going to do a device trial and you know that you're going to be billing something to insurance or CMS, make sure you know your process at your site. Adverse events for device trials are captured different than some other studies. So not all adverse events require reporting to the FDA, but your sponsor or protocol may define certain events that they would like collected. They may exempt events that are not related to the device. Any undesirable experience, whether or not related to the investigational device or procedure, should be captured, but it may or may not need to be reported. So you should at least collect that information and keep it in your source documentation, but it might not be something that you need to report to the sponsor or the FDA. And many times device failure may or may not be captured as an adverse event or be reported as an adverse event. What the FDA does want reported are serious, unanticipated adverse device events. So these types of events, sponsors need to report to the FDA and IRBs within 10 working days of being notified. What many sponsors and IRBs will require of you is that you notify them within 5 to 10 days of being notified, and then the sponsors will turn around and report to the FDA in an additional 5 to 10 days. And your investigator has the option to report any other serious problems that they feel relate to the right, safety, or welfare of subjects. This is a nice flowchart I found from the FDA website. And so this shows the large circle in blue, all adverse events that occur during a clinical study. The middle red circle, where you see ADE, is adverse device events, and these are all events related to the device. But within that circle, there's a green circle, SADE, which stands for serious adverse device events, and a purple circle, which is unexpected adverse device events. That looks like a lot of adverse events, and in certain studies it can be a significant amount of adverse events. But what the FDA is requiring to be reported is that small yellow circle in the middle. And this is what the FDA considers unexpected adverse device events that were serious. This is where you need to report to the sponsor or IRB within 10 working days, any type of these events. And this is really probably one of the best diagrams I found for understanding adverse event reporting for medical devices. This is a series of references pulled together for this presentation. If you are new to device research, there's a lot of great references and resources out there. There are some recent articles in the past, probably 2 to 3 years, that have even been specific to academic institutions if you are an academic institution. The FDA has a great website. There's a lot of information on the FDA website. It can seem a little overwhelming at first, but if you take your time and go through it, it's very well laid out that you can read through it over a period of time. They also have some great draft guidances that have come out in the past couple of years related to medical devices. That's it. I'm done. Thank you.